Hi, I'm Eric Winograd, Head of Developed Market Economics at AllianceBernstein. The topic on everybody's mind this year in financial markets is one that we haven't focused on in almost 40 years: inflation. Prices in the Western world are rising at the fastest rate we have seen since the late 1970s and early 1980s. The surge in prices came on suddenly. Only a year ago, prices were still rising very slowly, as they have done for most of the last few decades. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, they shot higher. Why? What does it mean? And why hasn't it happened in China, where prices are still rising only very slowly? The first part of the equation is easy enough to answer. As the global economy began to awaken from the COVID-induced recession, demand surged. Government support to households in Europe and in the US was unprecedented, with unemployment benefits and programs extended repeatedly, and income support making up for income that was lost during the pandemic. With millions of people out of work, it made sense for governments to step up and help. Then, thanks to the remarkable efficacy of vaccines, the economy reopened much faster than had been expected. The global economy surged as consumers spent the money they had received during COVID, and with the labor market booming as well, households found themselves in remarkably good financial shape. And if we know one thing about American consumers in particular, it is this: if they have money, they're going to spend it. And spend it they did. Consumption of all types of goods surged. If it could be delivered to an address, people bought it. There was a massive rotation out of services consumption and into goods consumption, and it's easy enough to understand why. While society was reopening, it wasn't fully reopened. Services industries are higher touch than goods. That makes them feel riskier in an environment in which many people were still concerned about their health. Think here about travel, or concerts, or sporting events, places where you find yourselves in a large group. While people were more willing to resume normal life, being in a large crowd like that wasn't appealing in the early stages of reopening, and in many cases it wasn't available. Rules and restrictions differed from place to place, and especially from country to country, which has limited the appeal of the sort of travel that people undertook pre-COVID. And with services less available and less appealing when they were available, consumers bought goods instead. We estimate that almost $1 trillion more of goods were purchased than the long-term trend would have suggested. That sort of surge in demand placed strains on producers that the supply side of the global economy simply couldn't keep pace with. Remember that supply chains are more global than they have ever been. So while consumers in the US and in Europe were ready to go, producers in many other parts of the world weren't. The vaccine rollout globally has been uneven, and with so many goods produced far away from where they are consumed, the supply chains simply couldn't keep up. Goods couldn't be produced fast enough, and when they couldn't be transported from place to place efficiently. The result was a massive imbalance between supply and demand, and when that happens, the natural impact is to push prices up. And that's exactly what we saw. Goods prices in the US are now nearly 20% higher than they were a year ago, and they are up sharply in Europe too. In the West, we tend to think about this as a global phenomenon, but it really isn't. China, for example, hasn't seen nearly the same pace of increase in goods prices that we have seen in the West. Zhenan, why is that? What is it that has kept goods prices lower in China?
Thank you, Eric. Yes, China's inflation dynamics post-pandemic has been indeed different. So last year, China's CPI inflation was only at around 1% on average. Interestingly, inflation in industrial sector, PPI, has been elevated, with the average last year at 8%. So why have we seen such a different inflation dynamics in China? Very mild CPI, but high PPI. There are several factors. So first, this reflects uneven demand recovery. Service and consumption recovery in China has been relatively slow, and household consumption remained broadly well below the pre-COVID trend. In the US, the priority may have been on providing support to households. But in China, the primary objective of policymakers was to provide liquidity for firms and to boost government investment, and much less about providing direct income support to households. Another reason that Chinese consumers have been slower to come back online is a comparative lack of direct income support to vulnerable groups. That has made lower income households relatively cautious about consuming. Second, there have been different idiosyncratic factors putting pressure on PPI and CPI on opposite directions. For instance, pork prices, which have declined more than 40% compared to a year ago, dragged CPI down. On the other hand, production costs, due to the government's aggressive push for decarbonization, as well as higher global oil prices, have put significant upward pressure on PPI. And also, impacts of supply bottleneck due to the COVID disruptions had been smaller in China than US. Of course, latest COVID outbreak in China has disrupted domestic logistics and supply chain significantly. Third, even though PPI inflation has been high, spillover from PPI to CPI has been limited in China. This, in some sense, reflects relatively weak pricing power in downstream sectors. One consequence of limited pass-through from PPI to CPI is we have seen profitability of downstream sectors, with SME accounting for the majority, has worsened materially.
Thanks, Shannon. It's interesting to see the difference in policy priorities and how that has played out. Both economies have seen higher prices as a result of the reopening, but in the US that has manifested in higher consumer prices because of support to households, while in China the priority on supporting the corporate sector means that they have been unable to push price increases through to the same extent. And I think that difference is a big contributor to the divergent policy outlooks today. Normally, we would expect that policymakers probably wouldn't need to do very much to respond to supply shocks and rising commodity prices. Supply-side constraints generally work themselves out over time. But of course, these aren't normal times. The Russian invasion of Ukraine came at a very bad time for the global economy. Just as we might have expected supply chains to heal and transportation services to become more normal, the invasion pushed commodity prices in general, and energy prices specifically, even higher. That means that when the peak in goods prices comes, it will be later than we had previously thought, and that peak will be higher. But that isn't really the biggest change in the outlook, and it isn't why central banks have started to get so aggressive. The biggest change is that inflation is no longer limited to goods prices in the West. Because the labor market has been so strong, unemployment has fallen to record lows in both the US and Europe, and incomes have risen. As COVID has receded, the sorts of services activities I talked about earlier are now available, and people are taking advantage of them. Services prices may not be going up as fast as goods prices are, but they are still going up more than they have in a very long time. And that's a problem for monetary policy. Services prices tend to be sticky. Once they start going up, they generally continue to until policymakers respond. That's different than goods prices, which tend to bounce around much more. Here it helps to consider what we mean by services, just to get a sense of what types of prices we are talking about. Rent or housing-related expenses tend to be the largest component of services inflation, and in most countries, rents don't reset often. So if they go up, they stay up for at least a year and even more. But also things like medical care and education factor into services. And again, these are things for which prices tend to repeat over time. So with services inflation now rising and goods prices still elevated, we've seen a dramatic change in the way that central bankers view the situation. During 2021, they generally thought of the supply chain-driven spike in goods prices as being transitory, and thus there was no need for them to respond. Now, however, they're singing a very different tune. Central banks from New Zealand to Canada and all around the world have already started raising interest rates, often by 50 basis points at a time. We expect the Federal Reserve to take its benchmark rate above 3% in the next few quarters, and the odds are that the European Central Bank will also start to raise rates. There are, of course, a couple of exceptions. One is Japan, where inflation remains stuck at very low levels, and where policymakers continue to work to push prices higher. The bigger exception, though, is China, where the Pboc has been cutting rates, even as the Fed and others around the world are raising them. Shannon, what's your outlook for the Pboc? How far could they cut rates, and why are they so out of sync with the global trend?
Thank you, Eric. Although major DM central banks are tightening monetary policy on inflation concerns, Pboc has been easing policy to show up growth since end of last year in order to achieve a decent growth rate this year amid significant downward pressure. They can do that because inflation is so much lower. The central government set a growth target of around 5.5% for this year. But strong policy support is needed to achieve that, especially following the latest COVID outbreak, which will make achieving the growth target more challenging. And inflation is much less a concern for China. Although I expect CPI inflation to go higher this year, it should remain within government comfort zone, and PPI inflation should moderate from last year's elevated levels. It's important to remember also that China's monetary policy framework is different from those in major DMs in several dimensions. For instance, although China has been pushing a transition to a rate-based framework like Fed, and the role of the policy rate has been indeed increasing, the quantity of available credit remains an important target for Pboc. And to achieve their credit quantity goal, the central bank has several tools. Since December last year, Pboc has cut policy rates to support credit demand and lowered required reserve ratio for banks to boost credit supply. In the coming months, we cannot rule out the possibility of more policy rate cuts, though concerns about the impact of lower rates on capital flow and FX stability could be a limiting factor. As a result, the Pboc may more rely on structured policy tools, for instance, relending, which means Pboc lends to banks so that banks could lend to real economy. These tools have been increasingly important in recent years for Pboc to not only boost credit supply, but also to support those areas that the government intends to support. For instance, SMEs, high-end manufacturing, decarbonization, innovation. Of course, in China, the most important and effective cyclical policy lever is always fiscal policy. For instance, boosting public investment. And this will likely happen this year as well, in addition to much policy accommodation is needed.
Thanks, Shannon. So it's a really interesting scenario we've laid out here. Most places in the world have an inflation problem. China doesn't. Most central banks are tightening. China's is easing. What does that mean going forward for the global economy? We remain optimistic that policy still works. And that means that over time we expect tighter policy in the US and in the Western world as a whole to play a role in containing inflation. Our expectation is that inflation in the US will fall gradually over the course of this year and into 2023. It isn't going to happen overnight, and the process won't be smooth. Tighter monetary policy means higher volatility in financial markets and slower economic growth. In China, as Shannon has noted, monetary policy isn't the only game in town. We expect that fiscal policy will also play a role, and that the combination of the two will contribute to supporting growth and likely will allow the Chinese government to hit its growth target in 2022 and beyond. Still, it's a remarkable divergence. Investors have questions about whether the US can slow growth down and whether China can speed growth up. Whenever we see friction like this, whenever major economies are moving in different directions, we think it's a recipe for volatility. In a global world, when different countries aren't moving together, it creates challenges for everybody. Monetary policy is most effective when it is harmonized, and when that isn't the case, it makes it harder for any individual economy to reach its objectives. It's harder for the US to slow down if China speeds up, and it's harder for Chinese prices to stay low if US prices stay high. It's another challenge for policymakers to confront in an already difficult time. And it's just one example of something we've been talking about for years: deglobalization. After almost 25 years of moving closer together, the US economy and the European economy are now moving further away from China's. Remember that pre-pandemic, the major story in financial markets was the trade war, and the issues that led to those trade disputes haven't been resolved. Add in the political tension around the Russian invasion and the Chinese response to it, and we see stress emerging in the relationship among the major powers across every dimension: economics, trade, geopolitics. The pandemic and the associated change in the global inflation environment didn't cause these tensions, but it's another unwanted source of friction and another issue for the global economy to cope with. We remain optimistic that our leaders will respond to the challenges they face and that the global economy will get through this difficult period, but the next few quarters are going to be bumpy. And with that, thanks to all of you for listening. Thank you, Zhenan, for your insights, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
投资一定有风险，基金投资有赚有赔，申购前应详阅投资人须知或公开说明书。